Hello, everyone. It's very good to have you here. That's purple on my screen, but it's blue up here, but we're going to work with it. It's fine. I'm Nate. I'm the CEO of Mito. Today I'm going to be talking about de-rigiding the widget, notably how we can make Jupyter a haven for startups. One thing I'll say here, please, if you have questions, raise your hand. Let's do it as we're going. There's a lot of things covered here, so I want to make sure you guys understand and follow as I'm going. I talk very fast, so please do clarify. So this talk is about the value of extensibility in the Jupyter ecosystem. And during it, I'm going to argue that with minor changes, we can make Jupyter the first place that startups come to build data science MVPs. And I think that should be a goal, and I'll argue that as well. Shout out to the London Jupyter Widget meetup, of which I see many of you here in the back. I plagiarized most of these thoughts from that conversations I had there, so thank you all. Obviously, all mistakes are my own. Duh. Cool. All right, so first of all, who is here? Who has heard of Jupyter Widgets? Okay, that's pretty good. That's impressive. For this room, I'm amazed. Who here is a startup founder? 1.5, 2.5. Nice. Okay, sweet. 3. Oh, nice. I know you. How many people here have developed Jupyter Widgets? Okay, a bunch. Very lovely. And how many people here have developed custom Jupyter Widgets? Okay, also a reasonable amount. Notably, more of you than there are startup founders, which I think is interesting. And finally, how many people here have used Jupyter Widgets? Okay, a bunch. Very cool. Okay, so yes, IPy widgets and Jupyter widgets are the same, at least as far as I understand, which could be totally wrong, but yes, they're the same. So who me? As I said, I'm Nate. I'm the co-founder of Mito. Mito is a 3-person startup. One of them's there. One of them's over there as well. Mito itself is a spreadsheet extension to JupyterLab. It lets you take a pandas data frame and edit it like you would edit a spreadsheet. You can write a formula, you can add a filter, you can make a pivot table, and in doing so, it generates the code that corresponds to those edits for you. I'll show you a demo of that a little later on. We're deployed at some of the largest banks in the US. We help analysts transition from Excel to Python, so we help make that move possible. And notably for this talk, Mito started as a custom Jupyter widget. Mito is now no longer a custom Jupyter widget. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll understand why that's the case. So first and foremost, for those of us who don't know, what is a Jupyter widget? Well, let's go look. I got 4 lines of code here, so nothing too crazy. From IPy widgets, which is the same as Jupyter widgets, we're going to import an in slider, we're going to create an in slider, and then we're going to display our in slider. Okay? Now, the in slider allows us to slide an integer. That's fantastic. That's amazing. We love that. Notably, though, the interesting part here is that if we print the value of this slider, the front end value that we adjust with the slider and the back end value of the Python object are the same. Okay? And so if we change this front end slider and we get a new Python value, that's the same. Similarly, if we change the back end value, the slider will change locations as well. Okay? And there's not just in sliders, there's float sliders, there's text inputs, there's date fields, there's all sorts of fancy Jupyter widgets that allow you to input some values. Notably, we can understand Jupyter widgets as essentially a front end for editing Python objects. A little bit more specifically, it's how you can sync state between the front end and the back end of your Jupyter notebook. And in terms of use cases, to make it very practical, it's how you take a notebook where you might be doing some data science or data exploration, and you actually turn that into the sort of a basic data app. You can imagine there's a lot of people who make notebooks, and then they send them to their colleagues who write no code, and their colleagues might have to adjust some paths, adjust some config variables. They don't know how to do that. All you need to do is add some Jupyter widgets, and now your users can use your notebooks even if they don't write any code. For some people, you'd be shocked. Even editing a single number in a line of code is completely disqualifying for using an application. So Jupyter widgets are very lovely to that effect. This is like the classic example from the docs where you can kind of understand how these things get composed into data applications. You have some sliders, and in doing so, you're adjusting the parameters to a graph, right? And here we're using a float slider instead of an in slider, but it's the same general idea. Okay, so far what we have is we have Jupyter widgets. They're these things that let users configure inputs on the front end. They sync to the back end. That's great. That's awesome. We're going to push it a little farther, and we're going to say there's something called custom widgets. Well, what are custom widgets? Well, they are custom UIs that you can make for things other than ints, for example. Okay, so you've got a bunch of default ones, but you also have the ability to make a custom UI for new, maybe slightly more interesting Python objects. In Mito's case, we were initially started as a custom UI for pandas data frames. Okay, so I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, we're going to render a Mito sheet. Mito appears. The widget previously was this. That's what we saw. The widget is now this big spreadsheet. I can import a CSV file, and in doing so, I just imported that off my local hard drive. I get two things. I first get a display of this pandas data frame. Okay, rows and columns, that's not so exciting. The second thing, though, is that you get code that corresponds to that edit here. And this is kind of Mito's, at this point, Mito's technique for keeping the front-end object and the back-end object in sync, which is the primary goal of widgets in some ways. Okay? I'll show you a little demo here with one hand. We can add a new column. Let's just call it new call. And I can write a formula like I would in Excel. So I'll write the month formula, and I can pull the date out. And in doing so, you can see we've added this new column with the months that we pulled out from the date. The same thing, if we print out this pandas data frame, God, programming with one hand is new for me. It's exciting. We're gonna run this. You can see that we get that new column here as well. So it's the same general idea. It's a slightly more interesting object than an integer, hopefully, but in the same general way, we're kind of keeping the back end and the front end synced to each other. Okay. Now, why did Mito choose to be a widget initially? There's a couple reasons, many of them quite obvious. Namely, as all of you here demonstrate, there's a large, lovely group of users that are kind of, in some ways, the target for Mito that we could essentially serve just by building ourselves into Jupyter. And more than that, I think the really cool part of this, of being a widget as a startup, is that instead of having to replace someone's entire workflow and saying, hey, instead of using Jupyter, come use this entirely separate platform, instead what you can say is, keep doing what you're doing, also use my tool as a piece of your workflow. And in doing so, this lets you experiment and test your early hypotheses very easily. That's a big piece of being a startup, is kind of saying, what are my hypotheses about my product? Let me build an early version of it. That might not be the world's most fantastic thing, but it lets me test if this is something actually useful. I think being a widget for Mito was the right choice because it allowed us to very easily sort of experiment with those questions without having to build too much ourselves. Okay, I'm gonna pause here. We've gone through what Jupyter widgets are. I've talked about what custom widgets are. I talked about why Mito is a custom widget. I'm gonna pause. Do you have questions and or corrections from the audience? Please, I beg of you, someone say something. Hello. Hi. Thank you. Okay, no questions so far? Cool. So, you now might be asking, Nate, thank you for the high-level overview. Let's get into brass tacks. Give me the specifics. What is in a Jupyter widget? Well, I'll tell you. And by the way, there's going to be a quiz as you're leaving. Pay attention to the slide. It's very important. You must remember every single detail. Now, the front end and the back end need to communicate. They do that through something called a comm. So the first thing here is you need to remember that there's a communication channel established between the front end and the back end to communicate. Of course, that communication channel has some internal structure. There's a comm, which is created by the kernel, and it uses ZMQ to communicate to a web server. You don't know ZMQ? You should. Look it up. It'll be on the quiz. More than that, you have to remember that these comms are established also in the front end, and there's specific ways that message IDs track so that you're able to know which messages go with which cells, et cetera. Of course, on the front end, you've got your widget model, but you also have multiple widget views. There can be multiple widget views per cell, but there can also be just one widget view per cell, and there can be multiple widget views in a notebook. Of course, you have to remember all of this is managed by the widget manager and the comms manager. These are the things that actually establish these things. And of course, don't forget about, as we're talking about this, that there's many versions of a lot of these packages, and you have to make sure you pick the right one, because if you don't, you won't be able to install anything. You'll get a blank error message, you won't be sure, you'll be confused, and you'll be sad. Trust me, I've been sad. I've been there before, and I'll be there again. And just to remember, the widget is the back-end part. Then there's a widget model and a widget view. These are all separate things, but important to keep in mind as you're developing these things. I was picking on Jupyter Widgets, which hopefully I balanced it before by talking about why Jupyter Widgets are lovely for startups. But I think that the point I'm trying to make here is that custom widgets, the API surface currently, they're both complex and they're opinionated. And for startups specifically, I think that has a couple effects. The complex APIs, practically what that means is that if you're trying to build an MVP that is a Jupyter widget, it's slow. It took Mito 2 weeks or something to develop the first version of our product. The first version of our product was an off-the-shelf React grid and then a single button that added one column. So very, very MVP as far as it goes. Pretty much 3/4 of the time we spent building that was figuring out how to get a React grid rendering in a Jupyter widget and using Jupyter state management. We had never done anything with Jupyter widgets before. It just took that time to get off the ground. The second thing is that the APIs are pretty opinionated. I won't get into details here, but you can think about things like state management. There's prescribed ways about how you're supposed to do state management in these widgets and how it's assumed widgets compose with each other. And this leads to something I called J for N. Came up with that yesterday. It's pretty good. pretty much just for notebook syndrome. It's where you build a widget and the kind of most of the infrastructure that you build, it sort of locks you in. If you then want to take that widget and put it in Streamlit or take that widget and put it in Data App, it's very hard to just take your core components and move them because of how opinionated the core widget framework is. And the last thing I'll mention, I touched on this already, is that there are persistent installation issues. Something like, in our observation, 40% of attempted widget installs don't work. Because of complex version issues, become of JavaScript issues. It's the #1 issue in our Discord and has been for a long time, as long as we were widgets. And that sucks. That's obviously not a super pleasant experience for users. So I laid out some issues for startup builders, but I want to be very clear that the current custom widget designs, I think, work really fantastically well for a huge portion of the builders here. And that's because custom widgets were designed for and built by the people who are building Jupyter Widgets generally, and generally JupyterLab builders. They're people who are steeped. I see them sitting here, lovely folks sitting here in this row. They know these interfaces. They use these interfaces. They work heavily with widgets when they work with companies and enterprises, et cetera. So these interfaces work very well for the people who use these day in and day out. But I think that there's a class of builders, of which I consider myself some, and I think you might be based on how much you're shaking your head yes. And also, you were a startup founder, right? Okay, sweet. I think that there's a class of builders described by maybe us here who don't benefit from all this complexity that's present in this framework. And maybe a different angle could lead us somewhere better. And that's what I'll talk about for the remainder of my talk in just a moment. So please, questions so far? Yeah, please.
Well, first of all, I thought the talk was going to be how to build a slider, so I'm a little but maybe on the installation side, we've done a lot of work. If you want to talk about how you've gotten around and attempted different routes around the installation.
Yes. Yeah. That's a great question, Jake. He wasn't a plant. He actually just came up with that right now. On the installation stuff, I'll say this. We stopped being a Jupyter widget because of some of the problems that I mentioned here, namely that we wanted to take Mito and bring it to other places. And we thought that was going to solve our installation problems, but there are still installation problems. And I think a big piece of this is that generally being an extension comes with installation problems. You have to, after you pip install something, you have to remember to refresh your page and restart your kernel. And that's tricky for a lot of users, especially because in some ways, the core user base of Jupyter Widgets are people who aren't necessarily, at least with a lot of our users, aren't necessarily the world's most expert Python programmers. They might be a little bit new to Jupyter. They're experimenting with UIs that they can give their other friends that are also new to Jupyter. So, yes? It's slightly decreased. So we have about 65% of the people who install our product succeed. Previously, it was about 63% of the people succeed. Previously, it was about something like 50%. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely one of the problems. That's one of the major observed problems is that we get users who show up on JupyterLab 2 and try and install us, and then I'm like, well, do you have Node? And they're like, no, and I'm like, yeah, me neither. So I think that's part of it. Generally, I would say there's a lot of undiagnosed errors where you render the sheet, it either doesn't create a comm correctly or nothing appears, and it's pretty hard to tell why that's the case. And there are error messages, but I'm not a JupyterLab builder. Again, this is sort of the cost of the complexity of this API is that I get an error message that says Jupyter Widget Manager doesn't exist, and I say, that seems possible. I believe you. Yes? Yes. And I think this is the key, right? There's an order of operations here. If you start out as not a widget and then you try and become a widget, it's actually not so challenging to do so. You can kind of jam anything into the widget framework if you just kind of use a subset of the API. The problem is, if you, like us, you made the decision to start as a widget, then your architecture is informed by those decisions, right? Initially we tried to use the state framework that was the widget state framework, and eventually when you outgrow that, you're kind of screwed. You're sort of locked in. And you can, just to be clear, you can escape. There is hope. We did it. And I believe that you can too if you try. But it's only necessary in certain conditions, namely if you're trying to bring your product elsewhere, and it costs something, right? It took us weeks to kind of rip out the widget framework. Cool. Wait, sorry, any more questions? I think there was one more hand. Yeah.
And I would love to have a guide for that because I think it's always all issue. Each new release of the widget, it's always the same.
It's always the same thing. Yeah.
I don't know.
it was really funny. I think during the London Jupyter Widget meetup, we had a conversation about version numbers, and it was like the number of version numbers that like we got it easy as widget developers. Just to be clear, the people actually developing these systems, there's like 300 version numbers behind the scenes I don't know anything about, and I don't want to. Good Lord, good luck, guys. Wish you the best. Okay, cool. So I've picked on Jupyter Widgets, but only for a specific set of users. And so I'm going to talk now to those specific set of users, and I'm going to say, here's what we want. Or I'm going to say, here's what I want. I hope you agree with me. Please agree with me.
I agree.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Here's what I think we need from custom widgets. I think this is the simplest thing that's workable, a starting point at least. I think we need a front end that renders in a notebook. I think the front end needs to be communicate with the back end. And I think you need easily accessible long-term storage. Okay, those are the three things. Now, these are all doable, just to be clear, in the current widget framework. You can get all of these things. But I think the current widget framework also gives you a lot of other stuff. So my claim is this is enough. And this solution that satisfies these constraints is, I think, something called rich outputs, which is not a term that I came up with, but as I said, I plagiarized most of this talk from the London Widgets meetup, and it's a term I was introduced to there. Okay? And I think that rich outputs stand to be this sort of simple, unopinionated framework that solves these problems. So let's actually sketch what this solution is. I think it's pretty much a function. You can think of it like a JavaScript function that takes 3 inputs. Okay? It gets a div where it can render some front end to. It gets a communication channel that it can essentially communicate with the backend, or a very easy way to establish that communication channel, and it gets this persistent storage. And notably, I think this is the important part and one of the key distinctions, it's not an extension to do that. It's not an extension. It's just JavaScript code that runs on the front end. Okay? And there's no need to, so if you pip install a custom widget, there's no need to refresh your page. You can immediately after just run the code, and it works. So in terms of the main 3 problems, and the thing I'll highlight here is that the 3 things that we want map pretty easily to the 3 things that we get, which is you want something to render, you get a div to render to, you want to be able to communicate, you get a comm channel, and you want some storage, so you get some storage. Okay, sounds good. In terms of how custom widgets actually compare to rich outputs, let's sort of break it down, specifically from my perspective, which is not everyone. I want to be clear about that, but for a startup MVP perspective. Complex APIs, I think it becomes much simpler to get started with. Very practically, what this means is that the current cookie cutter for JupyterLab widgets, which is a great place for getting started, is a few hundred lines of code. I think it probably, in this framework, could be closer to half of that or a quarter of that. So much less to deal with when you're getting started, which makes getting started much easier. I think in terms of notebook migration, things become much less challenging because the APIs are a lot less opinionated. You're not worrying about models and views. You're not worrying about Backbone. You're not thinking about Lumino widgets. You're just writing a front end whatever way you normally do. And really, just to make this point super clear, there's been 20 years of people fighting about how to build front ends effectively. 20 years of people talking about how to build forms and manage state and all that stuff. And I think the only conclusion that we can possibly have is that there's a bunch of legitimate ways of doing it. And prescribing one specifically, it locks off some use cases, or at the very least makes some use cases very unnatural, especially if you're leaving Jupyter. And the last thing here is I think this would fix most of our installation issues. I have a feeling that most of the installation issues here is that people install widgets and then they don't refresh their page. I think that's probably most of it, which sounds so silly, but it's kind of a barrier. Why would you think to do that after pip installing a package? You don't have to do that for any other package, right? And I really think that an API of this flavor, a very simple API of this flavor, has the chance to make Jupyter a really fantastic place for startups to build data science MVPs for their tooling. We talked about a bunch of these before. These were the reasons that Mito sort of chose to be a Jupyter widget initially, but the supportive community and the massive initial user base, these are standard for Jupyter. You get that whether or not you have custom widgets that are complex or simple. But I think you get additional things here, which is that it's now incredibly easy for users to get started with these things, these MVP products. It's also super easy for the MVP creators to make these things now. And notably, there's no lock-in to Jupyter. So they can start with Jupyter, experiment with people, very easily test things without having to build a huge ton of Python infrastructure themselves. And then if it's a legitimate product, they leave their widget and they can go build a full-fledged product around that kind of specific piece of functionality. And I think generally, this is kind of assumed here, but more people building things on Jupyter is good. The more MVPs that we can support and the more compelling we can make Jupyter for startups, I think the more tooling there will be for Jupyter users, which I think is cool and exciting. Certainly, at least for me. Yeah?
So if you released your separate framework that does
So just to be clear, this is a political push to push this framework forward. I am not a developer of Jupyter myself. I'm a consumer of these APIs. Contributing to this very explicitly it's not something that we do as of this moment. Yeah, this is me making an argument for how we can make Jupyter better for startups, not actually saying we've released a framework that does this. Yes.
But Mito uses this internally.
Sorry. I should have clarified that. I guess that was unclear. Mito does not use this internally. Mito hacks some shit together to make this happen effectively. Yes. So this you can get this done currently. You have to be an extension. You have to refresh the page. But Mito effectively starts as a thing where you get a comm, you get a div, and you get some storage. But we use a bunch of pretty dirty hacks to make that happen currently because it doesn't work super well within the current widget framework. Yeah. Yeah. So doable, but gross and messy and requires understanding at least some of the internals to get it done. Yeah. But it seems like that should be a blog post that I should write explaining our gross and dirty hacks about how to get it done. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Super fair. There's a talk. Oh, the lightning talks. Oh yeah, yeah. I definitely could talk more about like the hacks that we do to simulate some of this stuff, for sure. It's a huge piece of the design space that we had to like figure out as we were doing this. We're doing a bunch. I would say we're doing a bunch of other gross stuff. Partially from ignorance, partially because we don't understand the full API surface because we're not spending all day in Jupyter. We're spending most of our time building our product. But also because I think some things are not super easily doable, and so to do them, you have to sort of do something gross. Such as life. Yeah, so I just want to highlight this last point. I think just based on the hands raised in this room, from my perspective, I think Jupyter is a really fantastic ecosystem. I think that it's an especially fantastic ecosystem for enterprises. The level of customizability that you get with Jupyter is like no other product I've ever interacted with or seen. I think that there's some growing that the Jupyter community could do, specifically with respect to startups. I mean, it's a very open platform for building, and it's an incredibly welcoming and accepting community. 2 days into building Mito, I emailed Jason Grout, and I said, Jason, I didn't know who he was. And I was like, hey, Jason Grout, how do I do X, Y, Z? And he said, do this, do that, do this. And I was like, okay, thank you very much. So amazingly accepting community, but I think there's lots we can do to push Jupyter forward for startups. I think simplifying the API surface that you can arrive to and start building productively is probably the first step from my perspective. At least from our perspective, I think that's the biggest problem we ran into. So yeah, let's make Jupyter work well for startups. Thank you. Do you know the time currently? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. 1 or 2 questions. Yes. Yes, you're right that it doesn't. And it isn't currently. So, sorry, the question was, would you say that we need a better way to get something interactive? And is the claim that I'm making we need a better way to get something interactive in a Jupyter notebook? This is a great question. Why did we think we needed to be an IPy widget? Partially ignorance, but also because if you arrive and you're asking the question, I have a view of a data frame that I'd like to edit. The first thing that you stumble upon is how to share state between the front end and the back end in a Jupyter widget. How to share state between the front end and the back end in Jupyter, that's a Jupyter widget. That's what you're talking about here. You're talking about a shared state in a Jupyter widget. That's just where your Googles lead you. Potentially there's a documentation clarification here where we say, here's an easy way, here's a little hack that you have to do. I do think there are some hacks to get exactly what we want with Mito, but yes, I think it's a function of showing up with ignorance, being presented with a huge complex API surface about where you can extend the product, and not knowing where to start. And I think we need to guide people looking to build this sort of thing to a correct, simple location, which is I don't think what happens currently. In fact, I'm sure it's not what happens currently. Yes.
So are you now
There is currently no connection to the IPyWidgets API in our product. Yes. Yeah. I will say there is other stuff that we've had to hack in reference to that, but that's not, I don't think that's a function of the Jupyter Widgets APIs that are missing. It's more of a function of like accessing extension commands from elsewhere in your application. Yeah. So there are other complexities, but I don't think they're a function of ripping out the Jupyter Widgets API. Yes, yeah. Maybe.
much about it, but any widget is something that's come on the scene pretty recently that looks to try to decrease the entry point, reloading automatically, and things like that.
Oh, cool.
Not involved with it, but it looks kind of cool.
It's called Any Widget?
Yep.
Okay, shout out for Any Widget. Yeah, Any Widget. We've got an endorsement. Okay, yeah. Yes, I'll rephrase it for the microphone.
I would recommend to engage with it.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So the call out, which I think was fantastic, was one of the outcomes of the Jupyter Widget conference was this rich output idea. As I mentioned, definitely not my idea, just politically promoting it, so to speak. There's an experimental repo for that. Certainly something that we should engage with more. I think on a personal level, for us, it'd be super helpful. So yeah, great call out. Yes. Yeah, so there's an addendum slide that I wanted to show. I think one of the most helpful things in terms of this rich output framework that's not currently in there would be, by default, finding a way to put these things in iframes so that, like very specifically, Google Colab is never going to change the fact that they put outputs in iframes. And I think the fact that that isn't the case for widgets and other outputs in JupyterLab results in a lot of like cross-platform issues. So I think like within this API, I think there's an opportunity to standardize that sort of stuff. To your point, no, Mito doesn't work on Colab right now. We haven't found an easy way to work around these things. Yeah. I will say Pete Blois is like, when I shouted out the Jupyter Widget people, that conference, Pete Blois was the one who introduced me to all these ideas and made this repo and sent me this repo. So definitely worth checking out. I should have a link. Apologies, my slides are gone and I don't have a link in them anyways, but I will tweet a link today because you should check out that repo. It's great and shows you what this interface looks like in practice. So yeah, thank you all so much.